Unfortunately, in the news recently, we had the death of Christopher Tolkien, who passed away on January 15th, 2020. This is probably not news to most of you at this point because I'm doing this video several days later, but I did want to offer a tribute to his life's work, at least in regards to the furthering of the knowledge of JRR Tolkien, his father. Christopher Tolkien, of course, was the third son of JRR Tolkien and became his literary executor upon JRR's death as the one who was by far the most involved and connected to JRR's work with Middle-earth and basically anything else related to his corpus of literary achievement. And so Christopher Tolkien has played a huge role in practically anybody's life that has any connection to J.R.R. Tolkien, which I'll get into that in a minute. But just to fill in a few details of his early life in case you're interested, he was, as I mentioned, the third son of J.R.R. Tolkien. He ended up in the Royal Air Force during World War II, during which period J.R.R. was also doing some things connected to the war on the home front. And they carried on a lot of correspondence, including some stuff about the Lord of the Rings, which J.R.R. was in the process of writing at the time. After the war, Christopher Tolkien would go on to follow his father's footsteps as a professor of English at Oxford, and eventually would become a literary executor of J.R.R. Tolkien, and has basically dedicated most of his life to publishing and making available for publishing various things from the manuscripts and notes that J.R.R. Tolkien left behind after his death. And I want to kind of get into that because I think that really is the most powerful tribute we can give to Christopher Tolkien, who has published works of his own apart from his father's, and so I don't want to downplay that, but this channel, and of course anybody watching this channel is most interested in what he's done for us as fans of J.R.R. Tolkien and not so much in the academic works that Christopher Tolkien may have been involved in probably. So I'll leave that for other people to deal with. Anybody who is interested in Christopher Tolkien specific academic works, you can explore that on your own, find other people. But I do want to go over some of what he did for J.R.R. Tolkien's legacy. And that really begins with that period in the Royal Air Force when he was corresponding with his father, and even slightly before that, since J.R.R. Tolkien started writing The Lord of the Rings before the outbreak of World War II, although not really much before. But at any rate, the interesting thing about this is what a lot of people may not realize is just how much input Christopher Tolkien had and how much encouragement he gave his father in writing The Lord of the Rings, which took many, many years for J.R.R. Tolkien to finish. It was a very long project. He frequently encountered spots where he wasn't really sure what to do with the story or where it was going. But he had some correspondence with Christopher Tolkien. He, of course, also discussed this stuff with C.S. Lewis, and he was a great source of encouragement to J.R.R. Tolkien. But it is not beyond the reach of possibility to say that if not for Christopher Tolkien, we might not have The Lord of the Rings as we know it today, if at all. Because he would actually send chapters to Christopher Tolkien to read, and then Christopher Tolkien would make comments and whatnot. Christopher Tolkien also drew up the map of Middle Earth in 1954 that was kind of the main map that serves as the basis for what we know of as the Third Age map of Middle Earth, which has all of the territory concerned with The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. So that in itself is a big thing by, just on its own terms, but also, as I mentioned, we might not have The Lord of the Rings at all if it wasn't for Christopher Tolkien. We might still, because, as I mentioned, C.S. Lewis provided his own encouragement, but Christopher Tolkien definitely played a role. And even after that, of course, we get many other ways in which Christopher Tolkien is very much responsible for what we know of Tolkien's works. And not just Middle-earth, but let me start with the Middle-earth stuff, of course. Soon after his father's death in 1973, Christopher Tolkien took on the task of putting together the Silmarillion as we know it. And he had to do this from a bunch of incomplete manuscripts and notes. And so it was a very hodgepodge work in some ways, but he tried to be as true to his father's latest ideas as he could, while still maintaining a coherent narrative that flowed pretty smoothly. So literally without Christopher Tolkien, we would probably not have the Silmarillion at all and know very little about the first age of Middle-earth. And that means the Beren and Luthien story, which gets referenced in The Lord of the Rings, we would not know about. We would not understand Elrond's references to the Goblin Wars and Gondolin and The Hobbit. There's a lot of things we wouldn't have a clue about if it wasn't for Christopher Tolkien's work in this regard. He also, of course, published the Unfinished Tales some years later, which gave a lot of unfinished versions of stories or even unfinished things of new material that nobody had seen before on a variety of topics, some of them from the first age, some from the second age, some from the third age. And that is a huge piece of work. I would say if you're going to buy just a handful of things by JRR Tolkien as the author, I would say The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, and the Unfinished Tales are the absolute must-have. So, you know, half of that now is Christopher Tolkien's work, because The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings is, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien's. Christopher Tolkien gave us the other two in that, Silmarillion and the Unfinished Tales, and I think those are both critical. And if you really want to dig deeply into Middle-earth, now, of course, if you really want to dig deep, this is where Christopher Tolkien's great bulk of his life after his father's death is spent. That is the History of Middle-earth series, which ended up comprising 12 volumes. And it would be a disgraceful shorthand to say that these are just rough drafts of earlier versions of the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion stories. 4 of the volumes are dedicated to the Lord of the Rings early drafts, and the other 8 are dedicated mainly to the Silmarillion material, but also some other stuff. And these things, well, I mean, the 12th volume is actually more connected to the Lord of the Rings appendices, so there's 5 kind of connected to the Lord of the Rings. But at any rate, these are early drafts of all of those stories, but there's so much more to them. Although even if they were just early drafts, it would be interesting on its own terms. If you're familiar with the Silmarillion story of Turin Turambar, for instance, in some of the earlier versions of the Silmarillion materials, Tolkien actually spoke of a prophecy that Turin in the very last battle would be the one who gave Morgoth his death blow. When Morgoth comes back from being cast out into the void, Turin would come from the halls of Mondos and deal Morgoth his death blow. That kind of stuff, even though it's just an early draft, is a really interesting thing to consider. And since so much of what's in the Silmarillion is there as a kind of compressed narrative, and it's not the full versions of the stories because it's just kind of the synopsis version, you might say, it's not really clear what Tolkien would have put in the Silmarillion if not for the limitations of space that Christopher Tolkien had to deal with. So some of this stuff may have ended up in the final version had J.R.R. Tolkien had more time in his own life to finish it and really flesh all the stories out the way he wanted to. So on those terms alone, the History of Middle-earth series is a very interesting thing to look at, but it's so much more than that, because the History of Middle-earth series also gives us a lot of information on things that were in J.R.R. Tolkien's background in his own mind, things that he was considering, old, Norse legends, Anglo-Saxon, just all kinds of stuff that we wouldn't necessarily know about, but for notes that he left that Christopher Tolkien spent hours and hours deciphering. I mean, frequently in these books, Christopher Tolkien will comment, I had a hard time reading this because my father wrote in really light hand with really rapid handwriting, and it's really hard to read, and it's old. And in fact, there's even at least one occasion where he comes back in a later volume and says, that thing that I wrote about way back in volume such and such, I think I've figured out more of it, and now I can print it here. So, I mean, he literally spent years and years and years trying to decipher some of J.R.R. Tolkien's, works, because they're not all typed. A lot of them are handwritten and not easy to read. So that in itself is a monumental task, and it tells us a lot about what Tolkien had in the back of his mind. But he also includes a lot of stuff that's not even just early drafts too, because you've got unfinished stories like The Lost Road, which is supposed to be a story of Numenor, which isn't really connected to the Silmarillion or The Lord of the Rings directly. It was the origination of the Numenorian story, which he was supposed to do in conjunction with C.S. Lewis writing the Space Trilogy. So there's lots of stuff like that in the History of Middle-earth series as well. There's just an enormous amount of material there that adds a lot to our understanding of Tolkien and his worlds. And it's not just the history of Middle Earth and the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales. He's also had a hand in editing the edition of Beowulf that came out a few years back that Tolkien translated. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Tolkien's translation of that, he helped with. J.R.R. Tolkien also started a poem about the fall of Arthur, King Arthur, the legendary King Arthur of Britain. Christopher Tolkien put some of that material together and published it, as well as the legend, I'm forgetting the title, The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun. I'm blanking on the name now, but several different stories that are not even connected to Middle Earth, he has also made available to the public. And it's not even just what he's published, but because of his kind of gatekeeper role and his ability to make these things available to other people, he's also made texts available to other people to do their own academic work regarding Tolkien, or to publish their own, stories, like the Lay of Otru and Itrun, or I'm messing up that title too, I'm sure. But that one came out not too long ago. It was an old Breton story that J.R.R. Tolkien kind of reworked in his own way. There's also the Tale from the Kalevala, the story of Kullervo, which came out not too long ago. These are also things that were kind of made possible in part by Christopher Tolkien's work. And he also contributed to the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, which Humphrey Carpenter put together. And so the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien by themselves are a huge addition to our knowledge of what the man was thinking, what he had to deal with, the things that were going on in his life, and just give us a different perspective on him beyond just reading his biography. So there's a huge amount of work out there by Christopher Tolkien that we all have to be thankful for. Even if you've only ever read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the fact that the rest of this material is out there for other people to do research on and whatnot, it enriches all of us, because people like, say, Corey Olson, the Tolkien professor, or Tom Shippey, or Brian Sibley, all these people who really study the stuff can inform our understanding of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings even better, because of this other stuff that Christopher Tolkien has made available. And so Christopher Tolkien's life it's really been almost dedicated in service to J.R.R. Tolkien's legacy. And for that, if it was not for Christopher Tolkien, what we would have from J.R.R. Tolkien would be so much smaller, and great though it be, definitely a poorer amount of stuff. And so I think we definitely all owe Christopher Tolkien a great debt of thanks. And I just want to say here at the end that we all in the Tolkien community wish that Christopher Tolkien will have the stars shining on the end of his journey, and that his spirit will be rejoined with his father's outside the circles of Arda. And that is all I wanted to say about Christopher Tolkien. If you have your own thoughts about him, you can leave those in the comments below. But I'm going to leave it here. I just wanted to give a tribute to the man who has put so much time and effort into making our ability to really get into Tolkien so much more than what it could have been.